It's not about how much you make, it's about how much you get to keep. When you're selling an investment property, you typically have to pay what's called capital gains tax. Now, you may be familiar with something called a 1031 exchange that helps you defer taxes on that gain. However, what happens when you're going through, let's say, probate or divorce, and you don't necessarily want to reinvest all of those funds with the same people that you earned the gain with? In this interview, I'm talking to Ehud Gersten from Perch Wealth, and we're talking about a 1031 exchange alternative that's so good, your accountant might not even know about it. Let's dive in. The topic is how to invest in real estate when you're not necessarily wanting to take that active sort of property manager role that you want to fix all the toilets and deal with tenants. And so this is a super interesting conversation. And so Ehud, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this space and just how you joined us today?
Sure. Well, thank you, Alexa, first of all, for having me on today. And I fell into what I do right now. Prior to doing what I do now, I was a trial attorney, a litigation attorney for 15 years in San Diego, California. And if you've never ever met a litigator, unless they really love what they do, it's a soul-sucking job at some point. So I decided that I still wanted to help people, but I didn't want to do it through litigation. And a friend of mine, who actually is an attorney himself, was selling his office building, and he asked me to help him with his 1031 exchange. And I told him that I would. And I was a real estate attorney for a long time, and I thought that I knew everything there was to know about real estate. Turns out I did not know everything about real estate. And so I started researching options for him for 1031 exchanges and came across what I do now, which is Delaware Statutory Trusts, or DSTs. And that's how I got into it. And I've been doing that for about 5 years now. My business partner has been doing this for almost 20 years. We created a company called Perch Wealth, and we really focus on helping people that are doing a 1031 exchange or thinking about doing a 1031 exchange. We give them solutions and options that they may not know about.
Awesome. Okay, so for the people who are listening and they're like, that sounds really cool, but I have no idea what a 1031 exchange is, can you take us back to the beginning? What does that look like and what does that even mean?
Sure, absolutely. So the 1031 exchange, the reason it's called a 1031 exchange is because IRS Code Section 1031 says that if you're an investor and you own investment real estate in the United States, then you can sell that property. And instead of normally you would pay capital gains, let's say you bought it for 500,000 and now you sell it for 1 million. Normally you'd have to pay capital gains taxes on that sale, right? Because you made money. The 1031 exchange has essentially, it's a solution where you can take those funds that you got from the sale of that property and invest it into a new property or properties and defer those taxes that you would otherwise have to pay. And you can keep doing that. I say defer taxes, but we call it swap till you drop. Essentially, if you're an investor, if you're 40 or 50 years old and you keep doing this, you could keep doing this till you're 120 years old. And then at that point, and we can get into this later, your heirs would take that property that when when you died 120 years old, they then get a step up in basis when they inherit that property. You can essentially keep deferring those taxes, and every time you sell, you can invest in another property that's worth more and potentially increase your income every single time. And it's really the 1031 exchange. That's very a nutshell view, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, but it's been around in one form or another since 1921. So it's a piece of legislation, tax law, that works really well, and it saves a lot of people a lot of money.
Oh, yes. Okay, so we established what the 1031 is. And so we brought up capital gains. Now, there's a population of people, even some of our luxury listings, they still don't exactly know how to sort of calculate that and what that essentially means. And so, can you walk us through how those capital gains show up if you don't do some kind of exchange like you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. A great question. And so I just have to preface this with, I'm not a CPA. You should always
Sure.
talk to your CPA or your accountant or your tax professional. But essentially, let's use a very simple example. Let's say 30 years ago, you bought a property for $100,000 and you hold on to it for 30 years, you rent it out, you've been making income. Now that property, and maybe over the years, you've made improvements to that property, but let's say now you sell that property for $1 million. Let's keep it really simple. You bought it for 100,000. you sell it for $1 million. So now you have a gain of $900,000. Typically, you would have to pay taxes on that gain. If you live in a state like Florida, like we do, you don't have to pay any state taxes. There's no state income tax, but you would still have to pay federal income tax, which could be as high as 20% on that gain. That in our example, 900,000, you'd have to pay 20% in federal taxes. Plus, you'd have to pay depreciation recapture because over the years, you depreciated that asset and you saved money on those taxes. So now when you sell it, the IRS says, we want some of that money back. So you'd have to pay 25% of all the money that you saved over those years, which can be very significant.
Oh, yes.
And in addition to that, there's what they call the net investment income tax, which is 3.8%. So you're looking at a pretty high tax amount that you would have to pay the government. And if you live in a state, for example, like California, where I moved from to Florida, then you're looking at another 13.8% tax, state tax on top of that. If you're living in a state like in California, you could potentially be paying north of 40, potentially even 50% taxes on that income, which is significant.
Definitely.
So the 1031 allows you to defer those taxes. So rather than giving that money, the government itself says, you don't have to give us this money. All you have to do is take the money that you earned and buy something that's worth equal or more than what you're selling it for. And then we'll let you off the hook, at least for now, for the taxes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that. I also want to clarify because we have seen over the last couple of years here in South Florida, our property values have increased dramatically. And so a lot of our homeowners are now also having to pay capital gains. And I just want to clarify that the conversation that we're having is only relevant to investment properties. Unfortunately, if you end up walking away with a massive gain on your primary residence, that is still going to end up being something that you do end up having to pay capital gains on. And so I just wanted, for anybody listening, this is one of the main questions that I get is specifically about if it's your residential. What we're talking about with 1031 exchanges and what we're going to talk about in a second with DSTs are specifically for investment properties.
Yeah, no, I just want to make a short comment because you're absolutely right. That's exactly right. You can only do a 1031 exchange for what's considered investment real estate. And investment real estate doesn't mean that you made money from it. There's a lot of people that sell raw land that they've been sitting on for 40 years, but when they bought it, it was held for investment purposes. So really what the IRS is looking for is an investment purpose. And the facts will differ every single time. But for someone who's selling the residential property, that they're living in it, even though they can't do a 1031 exchange, there is another solution where they can also defer the taxes if they put it into an opportunity zone. And that's a whole other discussion. But you're absolutely right, Alexa. For investment property 1031, if they wanted to defer taxes on a residential property, they could do it with an opportunity zone.
I think we're going to end up having to bring you back one day to talk about that. Specifically on a lot of our luxury listings, we've seen people walking away with millions plus in terms of their sort of cash gain. And so just being able to sort of explain those types of things are always going to be super helpful. So taking it back to the investment side of it, now understanding for our clients that typically we're dealing with people who are going through probate or divorce of some kind. And so they're walking away with some kind of inheritance. However, they end up coming along with that. What is needed to sort of qualify for, or are there any qualifications for a 1031 exchange? And we'll get into the DSTs in a second here.
Sure. So 1031 in general, there's really no requirement in the sense that if you own investment real estate and you sell that property, as long as you're buying a property that's equal or greater value to what you sold, you could do a 1031 exchange. And it doesn't matter where you are in the country. It doesn't matter your income level. Anyone can do a 1031 exchange. The one thing to keep in mind is that there's certain rules within 1031 exchanges that you have to comply with. And, at a very high level, you have a very short time frame to identify your replacement property or properties. You have to have a qualified intermediary, someone that you're identifying the property with. They're like an escrow for escrow. They're holding your funds. So to answer your question, yes, anyone can do a 1031 exchange. You just have to make sure that you're following the proper guidelines and procedures. In terms of probate and divorce, A lot of times this comes up, for example, I'll use divorce as an example, right? You have a couple that's married, unfortunately it doesn't work out, they decide to get a divorce. If they get a divorce and they sell that asset that they jointly own, that's an investment property, it goes back to the same problem of having to pay taxes if they don't do a 1031 exchange.
Right.
The problem with that is that typically, if they're getting a divorce, they're not necessarily getting along. So for them to do a 1031 exchange, if they owned it jointly, now they have to agree on what they're going to invest in. And so it could be tough, right? And a lot of people pay taxes because they can't decide what to buy together, and it's still holding them together, and they just want to be done with one another a lot of times. Whereas the DSTs, and we can get into that later, can really solve that problem for them.
Absolutely. And we could say the same thing about in probate, where there's, let's say, multiple siblings or there's grandchildren involved, and maybe a couple of them are like, we want to reinvest, and a couple of the heirs are like, no, we just want to be able to buy our own property or pay for college or something like that. And so this really becomes a great option for people who may not be willing to take the entire sort of gain that they earned on that property and put it into another option. The other thing that I think that really stood out to me was with the 1031s versus the DSTs that we'll talk about is the fact that in most cases, when you're doing a 1031 exchange, you're going to be the one managing the asset as well, versus where we look at like a DST, that's something that is a little bit more passive. So I think we've done enough teasing at this point of what all the benefits of a DST. Can you just walk us through what that is?
Yes. So from a very global view, DSTs, it's an acronym. It stands for Delaware Statutory Trusts. And it started in Delaware on Delaware law. And basically what it is, so you might have a company. So I'll give an example. So one of the companies that we work with is Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald is a company based out of New York. They've been around since 1945. They manage, I think it's over $1 trillion now of half a billion, or sorry, half a trillion, over half a trillion of real estate. The other half, God knows what. But it's a very large company. So Cantor, to use them as an example, might go out and buy a $50 million property, a multifamily property in Dallas, Texas. And once they acquire that property, they package it into a DST wrapper. And at that point, they come to companies like ours, like Perch Wealth, and then they open it up to investors that are doing a 1031 exchange. And the reason that becomes really important for someone doing a 1031 exchange is because, first of all, like you mentioned, it's completely passive. So in this example, you're investing in a multifamily in Dallas that's worth $50 million that for most people, myself included, I can't afford to go out and buy a $50 million piece of real estate. But typically those types of real estate are very high-end institutional quality real estate. So that's number one. So you're getting into the type of real estate that for most of us, it's very difficult to get into. Number two, the minimum investment is only $100,000. If you sell your investment property for $1 million, you can allocate no more than $100,000 if you wanted to, and get into a property that's worth $50 million. And it's being managed by Cantor, which is one of the biggest real estate companies in the United States. And going back for a second to the divorce issue, you can have a situation where the couple that are now separating, if they don't want to talk to one another and they don't want to, be associated with one another, they really don't have to, because they can invest in a DST rather than paying the taxes, and they're not managing it. They don't have to make joint decisions together. And another reason to do it is that, let's say they decide to go into DSTs. Well, because the minimum is $100,000, let's say they go into 5 different DSTs together, then or let's keep it simple, let's say 4 different DSTs together, they can simply say, you get 2 and I get 2, and they're done with one another. And I'm giving you the tip of the iceberg right now. There's so many ways to do DSTs, and there's so many permutations that you can do. And but yes, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the two things that come up are, and feel free to answer them in whatever order makes sense for you, but the first one is the difference between the DST and like a REIT, so a real estate investment trust. Like, how are those two different? And then the second piece, but I just want to make sure I don't forget, is how the timelines differ. Because in a 1031 exchange, we talked about the time requirements, and I know things are not that the timelines don't exist for DSTs, but that there is an easier way to do that. And can you walk us through those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me answer your second question first. So think of the DST, think of the DST as it's just a vehicle to do a 1031 exchange. So we're still in the world of real estate. We're still in the world of 1031 exchanges. So all the rules and all the requirements of a 1031 exchange, they still apply to DSTs. And so if someone is doing a 1031 exchange or a DST as the way to do their 1031 exchange, once they sell their investment property, they have 45 days to identify what they want to go into, right? Whether it's a direct purchase through a traditional 1031 or a DST. And so they identify what they would like to go into. And then at that point in time, once they've identified, they have 180 days to close on that property. The problem that a lot of people face, especially nowadays, is that if you need to get financing, if you need to go get a loan from a bank, if you want to do your own due diligence on the property that you're looking to buy direct, that all takes a lot of time, and that can take a lot more time than 45 days. Well, the great thing about the DSTs is the way that I liken it is imagine you want to eat, right? You want to eat dinner. So you've got two options. You can go out to the grocery store, buy the ingredients, come home and cook it yourself, or you can go to a restaurant, they do everything for you. The DSTs is the second part, right? The restaurant part. You go to the restaurant, you look at their menu, you pick, this is what I want to eat, and everything is prepared for you, and it's done pretty quickly. We can close, we've done it in less than a week for 1031 exchange investors, which is typically unheard of in the world of 1031s. It's typically a very stressful process for anyone that's done a 1031 exchange, a traditional one. It's long, it's stressful. There's a lot of moving parts. With DSTs, you can be done essentially in a week. And to answer your first question about the REITs, they're very similar to your point. REITs or real estate investment trusts are essentially funds that have a bunch of real estate within that portfolio. And it's a great way to diversify. If you want to get into real estate, you can invest in a REIT. There's a lot of tax benefits as well that you can get from investing in a REIT. And you're diversified. You're investing in a fund that has maybe office buildings and warehouses and multifamily. There's only one problem with REITs. They're not 1031 exchange eligible. DSTs are very similar because DSTs, you can basically create your own, call it REIT, because you can invest in one REIT for $100,000, that's multifamily. You can do another DST for $200,000, that's senior housing. You can do self-storage, warehousing. So you're basically creating your own private REIT, if you think about it that way. And it's 1031 exchange eligible, which REITs, unfortunately, are not.
I love that. So I was recently right after we met, I was at an event. It was United Way hosts a joint tax and estate planning seminar every single year. And it's a couple of different organizations where they get a ton of attorneys and CPAs together to talk about estate planning and tax planning. And so I was having this conversation with a whole bunch of CPAs, and they were mind blown. This was not something that they had heard of before or knew it existed. And so I think this is going to be one of the videos that I share with our attorneys and our CPAs, because I want them to know that this is an option for their clients as well. So with that in mind, is there anything that you think that they should know when they're presenting this opportunity to a client?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not surprised to hear that. A lot of what we do is educate professionals like yourself, whether it's realtors, whether it's CPAs. I've even spoken to tax attorneys and real estate attorneys. I was a real estate attorney and I didn't know about DSTs as well. And so we spent a lot of time educating folks. I think to answer your question, the job of a CPA, a good CPA, is to save their client money legally on taxes. And I think what's good to have those arrows in that quiver for the CPAs, because they should know about DSTs. And so when they have a client that comes to them and says, I'm selling my property, and the CPA will probably recommend, if it's a lot in taxes, will probably recommend doing a 1031 exchange. But then that's where they kind of step back and say, well, I'm not a realtor, I can't help them. So I think it's good for them to know that there's DSTs as an option, that they can solve that problem with the 1031 exchange. And not only that, one of the biggest benefits really of DSTs, which goes back to your question about REITs, is you're diversifying your investment. If you own a property for $1 million and you do a 1031 exchange and you go out and buy another property, let's say for $1.2, $1.5 million, That's great. You bought a property that's worth more, you've deferred the taxes, but you're still invested in only one property. And so you've got concentration risk. DSTs allow you to diversify because the minimum is only 100,000 in DSTs. So you can go into, if you sold $1 million worth of real estate, you could technically go into 10 different DSTs and mitigate that investment risk, diversify it in such a way that, God forbid, if something happens to that particular asset or to the overall economy.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, going back to your question, so that's where CPAs need to know how to help their clients, because that's when they can tell their clients, look, it's not just about saving taxes. It's about making sure you keep what you've earned, right? We focus on making sure you get to keep what you earned. And for CPAs, they're always thinking it's not about how much you make, it's how much you get to keep. And so the DSTs become really important, not just for the 1031 side, but making sure that people are diversified in their investment. So if anything happens in the economy overall, the chances of everything failing is diminished.
So the two things that everything that you're talking about make me think about is specifically like looking at office space right now. So there's so much uncertainty in what's going to happen in that space. And so, I mean, I subscribe to like South Florida Business Journal and Financial Times and all these other platforms. And it's pretty rare to go more than 2 or 3 days where somebody is not talking about the uncertainty in office space. And so does that mean that it's a bad asset class? Maybe, I don't know, but doing an option like this becomes, well, maybe you can dabble a little bit without having to put all your eggs in one basket. I think that's one of the biggest benefits. And the other side of it is, I remember when you were teaching this, one of the biggest things that you really talked about was the fact that for, let's say, someone who's retiring or someone who has no desire to have to manage property. Let's say, for example, you have a divorce situation where maybe one partner has no experience in managing property. This is a great option. Even going into estate planning, I would love to hear you talk about that side of it as well, because forget about just the probate and trust administration for when you're receiving the inheritance, but what about the sort of planning for your legacy? How would someone go about using a DST or a 1031 exchange for that?
Yeah, and we've had a lot of clients do it primarily for that purpose. In fact, I had a conversation with a client last week that was, he's got a young daughter. She's 10 years old, and he's worried that if something happens to him, that he doesn't want to leave the property to her. She's 10 years old. She's not equipped to manage a big piece of real estate right now. In his estate planning, he's going to be selling this property. He's going to take those funds. He's going to diversify them over several DSTs, and those DSTs are professionally managed. So if something happens to him, his daughter doesn't need to worry about managing any of these properties. The distributions would be paid to her monthly, and there's no, and I should also mention, it's not just a matter of the managing. The companies that we work with are some of the largest real estate companies in the United States, and they manage billions of dollars worth of real estate. So before they even acquire a piece of real estate, they've done a lot of due diligence. We also do due diligence on their due diligence, but we want to make sure that it's a good investment. But to answer your question, yes, it's all passive. And when you're doing your estate planning as well, I'll give you another example. It's not just about the passive management. Sometimes we have clients that are, older, let's say their 70s, in their 80s even, and they've managed property for 30, 40 years. They're tired. They don't want to deal with tenants or toilets or trash anymore. And so they want to do DSTs. But one of the other reasons that they invest in DSTs is, let's say they've got 4 grandkids, right, that they love and they want to leave these assets to when they pass. The problem is that they know that if they only own one asset, there's a greater probability that those 4 grandkids might not agree on how they want to allocate that asset, right? One of them might want to sell, the other one might want to keep it. And it leads, I've actually seen this, it can lead to fights, right? It can lead to families literally breaking apart because of not knowing how to manage these properties or having different intentions. What these investors will do is they'll go into DSTs, and in their estate planning, in their will or in their trust or wherever they want to do it, they will allocate a DST or DSTs to every heir that they want. Or maybe they don't want to leave it to their children. Maybe they don't have children, so they want to leave it to, the Miami Zoo or something. You can easily do that with the DST in a way that's much more challenging, much more difficult to do with the traditional property that you own yourself.
I love this. This is something that, like I said, I was so excited to bring you on because when I learned about this, I'm like, everyone needs to know. Like every single person who deals with clients needs to know about this. Our clients need to know about this. And so I'm so grateful for professionals and experts like you who are so specialized and so niche in exactly what you do that we truly get to deal with an expert. And I know that everyone considers themselves to be an expert, but to truly be able to dig in like this and really understand that there are other options beyond just the traditional 1031 exchanges, I think is such an important conversation. So with that in mind, is there anything else that you think that somebody should know about if they're considering investing in, or maybe advising a client to invest in a DST?
I think it's important to know that anything in life, some things are better, some things are not as good. And so I think if you're considering doing a Delaware Statutory Trust, investing in a DST or multiple DSTs, I think it really becomes important to know ultimately who you're investing with. So for example, there's about maybe, let's say 50 different DST, we call them sponsors, the companies that put these deals together. There's maybe about 50 of them. And like anything in life, they're not all created equal. They all have different niches. Some of them only do triple net properties and triple net retail, like CVS's and Walgreens. Some of them only do warehouses, some only multifamily. So it really becomes important if you're going to invest in a DST to understand the sponsor, right? If you're going to fly on an airplane with a commercial airline, you want to know that that airline has pilots that they vetted, right? You want to know that they have a track record of safety. So it's the same thing like anything. You want to make sure that you understand the track record, and there's never any guarantees, right? There's always a potential for loss in any investment. But again, you can mitigate that loss by doing your homework up front and really understanding the sponsor. And it's not just the sponsor. So I'll give you an example. Like you mentioned office space, which is a really great example, actually, because you might have an amazing sponsor that owns office space in an area that it doesn't have a need for office space. It doesn't matter. So you need to look at the asset class that you're investing in, and you need to look at the sponsor, and you need to look at the geography of where you're investing in as well. For example, if you invest in a 50-story office building in Minot, North Dakota, I'm not picking on Minot, I've never been to Minot, but let's say you're investing, there may not be a lot of demand for that, even though you might have the best sponsor in the world. On the contrary, you might have an asset class like a multifamily in Miami,
Right.
and it doesn't matter I shouldn't say it doesn't matter who's managing it, but
It
chances
matters
are
a lot less.
exactly. There's a higher probability it's going to work. That's the one thing I would tell folks is that if you're going to invest in DSTs, you really have to understand any investment. Who is the company managing it? If you're going to invest in stock, for example, you want to know there's a difference between investing in Apple stock and a company that's being run as someone's garage, right? So you want to understand the differences between those. It's the same thing here. And before we go, I want to thank you as well, because a lot of people don't take the time or the effort to learn about this. And I think it's great that you do. And I think it brings a great value to your clients when you're able to give them options, because really what we're here to do is educate our clients and give them as many options to consider and act as really as advisors, right? You are a source of knowledge for them that they can act upon depending on their circumstance. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always say our job as the advisor or the consultant is to present all of the options and help our clients understand what the pros and cons of each of those are, and help them make a great decision for their families. It's not our decision to make for them. It's here's your options, here's why you should, here's why you shouldn't, and let's help you accomplish the goal. The last thing I wanted to add was I made the office space reference, but I don't know that we actually gave context as to why I use that as a sort of questionable asset. Because of all of the work from home kind of back and forth right now, there's a lot of conversation right now about what's going to happen in office space. We've seen, depending on when you're watching this, we've seen with the kind of up and downs with interest rates, a lot of commercial property has adjustable rate mortgages and adjustable rate loans. And so One of the big concerns was as rates were going up, when the restructuring was happening or their balloons were coming due, that they were not going to be able to afford it because there was so much vacancy. I did just want to give color to that conversation because I think it's important to help people understand where exactly we are in all these different types of classes. So with that in mind, this was awesome. I know that anybody who takes the time to listen to this, advisors, attorneys, CPAs, and our clients are all going to be mind blown. They're going to be probably just as mind blown as I was. And so with that in mind, when someone is looking to reach out to you and they're like, done, I need to have a conversation with this guy, like Ehud is amazing. Tell us how to reach you.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. They can reach me. First, I recommend you can email me. It's eGurston@perchwealth.com. They can find us on perchwealth.com. We have a YouTube channel with educational videos. And on our website, we have a lot of articles that we've produced. And they can call me, my cell, 619-471-6019. That's my cell. I'm happy to talk. This is what I do day in, day out, is just a lot of it is just educating folks. And like you said, Alexa, it really comes down to giving them the options. And then ultimately, people are smart enough to decide what they want to do. They just have to be presented with the facts. They just have to be presented with the options. That's how they can find me and our company. We're national, so we have clients literally from Hawaii, Alaska, all the way to Florida. Basically, we cover the entire United States. We have offices in California, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, and we can help you anywhere. And sometimes, look, and I'll say something else. Sometimes a DST might not be the best option for someone if they just want to buy something themselves, then that's fine. But we're always happy to educate, always happy to explain and see if it is a good option.